Thanks a lot, Phil. Thank you all for being here this morning. I think it goes to attest to what people think of Philip Stein, that the minute he got the idea to run this conference, the very, very top echelon of advisors from the U.S. immediately decided to come to Israel just because Philip requested and speak for you today. I think we have a great opportunity today because we really have a great cadre of people from the U.S. and from Israel to kind of go through all the different aspects and different facets of the, of what the world is right now. I'm going to talk about the Israeli Voluntary Disclosure Program. It's, again, the Israeli side, but we're going to basically be focusing on U.S. citizens and the type of situations and cases in which we find that U.S. citizens are supposed to apply for the Israeli Voluntary Disclosure Program. Generally, what I'll be talking about also applies to people who are not U.S. citizens. I mean, it's more or less the same programs. But in the case of U.S. citizens, we have different considerations because by definition, anything that happens in Israel also affects whatever happens in the U.S. because people living here in Israel are subject to reporting requirements in both countries. So I guess it's important to make sure that all the pieces of the puzzle fit together before moving forward. So just a word about my presentation. I wasn't aware, Phil, that we could put commercials in. I mean, I would love to do that. So that may be for the next perfect storm. I think they say in the Israeli army, everything is divided into three parts, except for the chicken. And that even though they just recently retired me from reserve duty, I followed that rule and I kind of did it twice. We're going to divide the presentation into three parts. Each of the three parts talks about a different arrangement for voluntary disclosure that the Israeli authorities have based on dates. Of course, this being Israel, a lot of the regimes for voluntary disclosure overlap. It's unclear which regime you can come under at what time, but there are three distinct periods, I think, and we'll try to talk about each regime. And also, I tried to, in order to illustrate the different facts that we're seeing from our clients, I gave three typical cases of U.S. citizens that have gone or need to go to Israeli Voluntary Disclosure Program, just to illustrate the cases. So first period we're talking about is 2007 to 2011. We have, details of the Department of Justice investigation of UBS coming out at this time. We began receiving requests from clients who basically had been holding accounts at UBS. Quite often, our clients were U.S. citizens, either sons and daughters of the U.S. citizens who actually opened the account originally and then moved to Israel. Other times, there was inheritors, and sometimes they were the original account owners themselves. And as these people came in, I think nobody knew exactly what was going to happen. People had heard rumors about UBS lists that might go over to the U.S. authorities. People began receiving letters, and everybody was very distraught about the implications of having these bank accounts in the family for years. These are people that are living in Israel, holding U.S. passports, not reporting the existence of the bank accounts, but in Israel not reporting the income from these bank accounts. So you have people, and in the foreign banks, you always have passive income from these bank accounts, which from 2003 onward, this type of income was taxable in Israel. And since the first right of taxation is in Israel, they had a problem not only in the U.S., but first and foremost in Israel. Because according to the U.S.-Israeli tax treaty, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware, first right of taxation on investment income goes to Israel. So in fact, quite often after paying tax in Israel, there wasn't any tax left to pay in the U.S. or very little tax to pay in the U.S. But psychologically, when these clients come in, they're not afraid of the Israeli authorities. At that time, people think, and this is the common mindset in Israel, that if you have money in Switzerland, nobody will know about it forever. These are numbered accounts, hold mail, no names, and the people coming in to our offices say, well, we want to come clean in the U.S. because of this UBS investigation. And as we tell them, you really need to come clean in Israel first, for two reasons. First of all, you have the same problem in Israel that you had in the U.S. And second of all, if you don't come clean in Israel first, you're going to end up paying double tax. First, if you pay first in the U.S., you cannot get credit in Israel for the tax you paid in the U.S. Of course, this is not only a rational issue, but it's a psychological issue. And psychologically, everybody was afraid of the IRS and not of the Israeli authorities. So basically, this was a general dilemma in 2009. It's still a dilemma, but I think it's become more and more accepted to conduct a voluntary disclosure in Israel first, and then once that's arranged, to go to the U.S. At the time, what we have in Israel is what's called the 2005 Voluntary Disclosure Program. There's no legislation on this. This is just informal administrative guidelines on how to handle voluntary disclosure filings. The preliminary conditions which haven't changed from 2005 until now is that you need to make an honest and full disclosure of your tax situation. That's, I think, the most important thing. If you disclose, you can't just disclose one problem that you thought of. You really need to go and search throughout your tax reporting and see what all of the failures, misreporting, issues and problems with your tax reporting. It can be stuff as small as, taking expenses you weren't supposed to take. But once you enter the program, you need to really come clean on everything. You can't just come clean on one single bank account. If you do that, you're in a very great risk of being in a situation where you abuse the system and the tax authorities will come after you with a lot of force. Second thing is, somebody joked to me yesterday that it's not really voluntary disclosure now because nobody's coming in voluntarily. People are coming in because they know that at some point their information is going to be turned over to the tax authorities. This can be in 5 years, in 10 years, but I think, we all know now that bank account information is no longer secret in this world. But having said that, still a very important condition is that voluntary disclosure is not made after the information has been received by the tax authorities or after the information has become public. So if there's a newspaper article about your bank account, you can no longer apply for the voluntary disclosure program. If somebody sues you and mentions that you have a bank account outside of Israel, that's no longer eligible. If there's a police investigation that concerns these assets, you're no longer eligible for the voluntary disclosure program. Now, formally in 2005, the request should have included the name of the taxpayer, but as a practical matter, almost nobody did that. Almost all requests were anonymous, and there was a lot of mess on who you apply to, how to apply to. Some advisors would go and apply to 3 different tax offices with the same issue anonymously, see who gives them the best deal on paying tax, and then move the address to that location and file the named request at that point. So there was a mess, and people took advantage of the mess. That was changed, as we will see in the next programs. So second phase we move to is when things get a little trickier. We no longer deal with a simple case of an Israeli resident, U.S. citizen with a bank account. But now we're dealing with families, and families are spread out all over the world. So you can have basically a brother that's in Israel, a sister that's in the U.S., somebody in Europe. Either everybody has U.S. passports or just one of the siblings has a U.S. passport. And since a lot of the cases deal with money that was inherited, a lot of times from Holocaust survivors or people who put money away in Switzerland after the World War II to make sure that they have some kind of fund for a rainy day, the cases become much more intricate. There are a lot of permutations on the same idea. You can have everybody with American passports. You can have just Israelis that one of the brothers moved to the U.S. and got a citizenship, and then we have these joint accounts that they're holding, and the joint accounts are held outside of Israel. But now it becomes an issue that only one of the siblings needs to report in the U.S., or they both need to report in the U.S., but you see a lot of situations where the U.S. citizen living in Israel at that time still had no real desire to go to the U.S. and report their income. I mean, this was before FATCA, before the banks started sending the W-9s in, and the typical response from somebody with an American passport living in Israel, when you told him that he needed to report his income in the U.S., he said, yeah, I know, but I don't care. That's kind of how people dealt with it at that time. So at this time, we had to make very careful reporting and planning and plan out very, I guess, meticulously what's going to happen in each country, especially when there's differences in the character of the income between Israel and the U.S., when you have situations where for one of the brothers is taking a tax position in Israel that's probably going to hurt the other brother in the U.S., etc. But a good thing that happened at this time was that in 2011, the Israeli tax authorities came out with what was called the temporary measure, Horat Shah. And I think this was one of the more brilliant moves of the Israeli tax authorities, that they decided that they will be granting a concession to people who came clean in 2011. And they, I think, quite accurately told people that bank secrecy is not what it was, and it's deteriorating. And this is the right time for people who held foreign bank accounts to come in. So basically, this 2011 procedure was based on the 2005 procedure, but it was limited to assets abroad. Real estate and bank accounts, but I think 95% of the people who came with Swiss bank accounts and foreign bank accounts. There was a requirement to provide the names of the taxpayers. Until June 2012, you had to file the name of the taxpayer, but then in June 2012, you could actually file an anonymous submission for a period of 3 months that ended on Yom Kippur 2012. There was basically an exemption from penalties and interest, and you can only pay 50% linkage differences, which in Israel meant that you were basically paying the nominal tax you owed in today's currency, which was a huge discount on the tax owed. And in some cases, the tax authorities attempted to tax the principal amount in the bank account. But if you could demonstrate that it was from inheritance or for a gift, then you could definitely be in a situation where the principal of the bank account was not taxed. This was, I think, the best program available in Israel. Unfortunately, not everybody decided to take advantage of it. And I think a lot of people right now are really sorry or disappointed that they didn't come out in time and file these requests. We move on to current day, and now we are facing a new genre of cases. What's happened is basically this. U.S. citizens living in the U.S. have started receiving W-9s from their Israeli banks where they're holding money in Israel. It's still a mystery to me how the bank finds out how people are exactly U.S. citizens. I mean, sometimes you see somebody who has no connection to the U.S. and they get the W-9. They've never lived in the U.S. They weren't born in the U.S. and still received W-9s from the banks. The banks started freezing up assets, and people will talk about that later on, and not releasing assets from held by U.S. citizens until W-9s are provided, not allowing them to transfer the funds outside of their Israeli bank accounts. And you have a subset of people who live in the U.S., have Israeli bank accounts, have not declared them in the U.S., and are now required to file W-9 and declare their Israeli assets. I mean, there will be speakers here after me that will explain what happens in the U.S. in these cases, but I want to talk about the Israeli aspect. We have seen more than just in one or two cases. We have seen that when these people come to us and they say, I received a W-9, but listen, this is not really my bank account. What do you mean? What do you mean this is not your bank account? It's in your name. You opened it 10 years ago. And say, yeah, well, it's actually my father or my brother has been holding this foreign resident bank account here in Israel and making all their investments out of my foreign bank account, because a foreign bank account is tax-free in Israel. So they're using my tax status as a foreign resident to basically not pay tax on investment income. But the money there isn't mine. I never deposited any money there. The profits are all going to my father or my mother or my family or my brother. And this bank account is just being used for its status. Another typical case you have is people here in Israel, we used to have an exemption for selling apartments. Now, when you sell an apartment, you're basically exempt from tax. But it used to be that you could only do it once in every 4 years. Now, what people did was they bought apartments in the name of each family member. And often they opened a bank account in Israel for a family member that was currently abroad, had no idea, paid for the apartment out of this account, then sold the apartment, put all the money in the account, either left it in the account or transferred it to some other family member who needed the funds. So these bank accounts were really used for the rest of the family. But now we're in a situation where this needs to be reported in the U.S., and you come to an American advisor. American advisor says, okay, this was not your funds, so let's see that somebody else reported this income in Israel. And at that time, sometimes what we need to do is go to a voluntary disclosure in Israel and say that the Israeli brother or father or mother really used this bank account to evade tax here in Israel. If you can get clear of that hurdle, sometimes you can go to the U.S. and clear the American hurdle. So we're getting into infinite complexities here in Israel. After a long wait, in 2014, the tax authorities published a new temporary measure, which basically gave two different tracks. It's in effect for 1 year, and it allows, first of all, formally allows you to file anonymous requests for voluntary disclosures, and put a deadline for the ITA to handle the requests in 90 days, which I'm willing to bet will never happen. I'm taking bets right after the talk. And the second thing they did was allow you, in case of a smaller bank account, to basically just, principal needs to be under 2 million shekels, income needs to be under 500,000 shekels. If you have this type of bank account, you can just file and pay the tax, and you won't even necessarily be audited. So this is probably the fastest type of track that you can file voluntary disclosure in Israel. However, unlike the 2011 measure, there's no exemption on fines, interests, and linkage differences. Generally, you can negotiate that, especially if you're going down the anonymous track, when you can always pull out, but it's going to be difficult to negotiate this with the tax authorities. It's of course going to be based on the way you present the case, the facts, the circumstances, your goodwill, and how you never knew you really had that bank account, etc. And there's no limitation. I mean, 2011 was limited to foreign assets. 2014 has no limitations. You can basically use this for any type of tax offense. So I guess that if you compare the three programs here in Israel, I guess that the best one, as I said, was the 2011 one. Anybody who had the chance to get into the 2011 program, I think, got the best deal. The only problem with 2011 program is it took years for the tax authorities to give you your amnesty, and for them to basically finalize the situation. People waited for 18 months, 24 months, especially when people were waiting to file their U.S. tax returns. That could take a toll psychologically on a lot of these clients, some of which are not young. As far as the type of disclosure, right now the program allows you to disclose any type of tax offense and sets a time limit on when the ITA is supposed to answer your request, which I think is very favorable for the taxpayers. But unfortunately, there's no longer the exemption from penalties, interest, and linkage differences that you used to have in 2011. It's now subject to negotiation. And we need to remember, just as a final thing, that the 2014 program is limited just for 1 year. So I guess we're probably going to see a new program after that might even be worse for Israeli taxpayers. So I think anybody who hasn't got the message right now probably needs to think and see whether or not it's a good idea to stay with undisclosed income in this day and age. So that's more or less it. Before I step down, I'd like to kind of say that I'm very happy that the people speaking right after me are Bill Sharp and Robert Katzberg. Phil, you're going to introduce them, right? So I had a chance to spend some time in Zurich with these two gentlemen, and I think that they will definitely, together with the other speakers here, really bring you up to speed on what's happening in the U.S. So I think it's a great privilege to listen to them. Thank you very much.